Okay. Concepts of our language, placing them outside this earth and beyond man's reach. Exaltation is usually taken to mean an emotional state evoked by contemplating the supernatural. Worship means the emotional experience of loyalty and dedication to something higher than man. Reverence means the emotion of a sacred respect to be experienced on one's knees. Sacred means superior to and not to be touched by any concerns of man or of this earth, etc. But such concepts do not do name actual emotions, even though no supernatural dimension exists, and these emotions are experienced as uplifting or ennobling, without the self abasement required by religious definitions. What then is their source of referent in reality? It is the entire emotional realm of man's dedication to a moral ideal. It is this highest level of man's emotions that has to be redeemed from the murk of mysticism and redirected at its proper object, man. It is in this sense, with this meaning and intention, that I would identify the sense of life dramatized in the fountainhead as man worship. For the same reason, Ayn Rand chose the aesthetic moral concept anthem for her present title. In doing so, she was not surrendering to mysticism but waging war against it. She was claiming for man and his ego the sacred respect that is actually due not to heaven but to life on earth. An anthem to the ego is blasphemy to the pious because it implies that reverence pertains not to God but to man and above all to that fundamental and inherently selfish thing within him that enables him to deal with reality and survive. There have been plenty of egoists in human history and there have been plenty of worshippers too. The egoists were generally cynical realists a la Hobbes who despised morality. The worshippers, by their own statement, were out of this world. Their clash was an instance of the fact value dichotomy which has plagued Western philosophy for many centuries, making facts seem meaningless and values baseless. Ayn Rand's concept of an anthem of the ego throws out this vicious dichotomy. Her objectivist philosophy integrates facts with values, in this instance, the actual nature of man, with an exalted and secular admiration for it. The genre of anthem is determined by its theme. As an anthem or hymn of praise, the novel is not typical of Ayn Rand in form or in style, although it is typical in content. As Miss Rand has said, Anthem has a story but not a plot, that is, not a progression of events leading inexorably to an action climax and a resolution. The closest thing to a climax in Anthem, the hero's discovery of the word I, is not an existential action but an internal event, a process of cognition which is besides partly accidental. It is not fully necessitated by the earlier events of the story. Similarly, Anthem does not exemplify Ayn Rand's usual artistic approach, which she called romantic realism. In contrast to her other novels, there is no realistic contemporary background and relatively little attempt to recreate perceptual, conversational, or psychological detail. The story is set in a remote, primitive future and told in the simple, quasi biblical terms that befit such a time and world. To Cecil B. D. Mill, Ayn Rand described the book as a dramatic fantasy. To Rose Wilder Lane, in answer to a question, she classified it officially as a poem. She held the view of the book in regard to its adaptation to other media. To Walt Disney, she wrote in 1946 that if a screen version were possible, I would like to see it done in stylized drawings rather than with living actors. Then, in the mid 1960s, as I recall, she received a request from Rudolf Nureyev, who wanted to create a ballet based on Anthem. Ordinarily, Miss Rand turned down requests of this kind, but because of the special nature of Anthem and because of her admiration for Nureyev's dancing, she was enthusiastically in favor of his idea. Unfortunately, neither a movie nor a ballet ever materialized. The point is that animation or ballet can capture a fantasy, but not Soviet Russia or the struggles of Roark or the strike of the men of the mind. Anthem was initially conceived in the early 1920s or perhaps a bit earlier as a play. At the time Ayn Rand was a teenager in Soviet Russia, some 40 years later, she discussed the work's development with an interviewer. It was to be a play about a collectivist society of the future in which they lost the word I. They were all calling each other we, and it was worked out as much more of a story. There were many characters. It was to be four acts, I think. One of the things I remember about it is that the characters could not stand the society. Once in a while, someone would scream and go insane in the middle of one of their collective meetings. The only touch of this left is that only touch of this left is the people who scream at night. The play was not specifically anti Russian. I was not taking my revenge on my background, because if it were that, I would have been writing stories laid in Russia or projecting them. It was my intention to wipe out that kind of world totally. I mean, I would not want to include Russia or have anything to do with it. My feeling toward Russia at that time was simply an intensified feeling that I have had from childhood and from before the revolutions. I felt that this was so mystical, depraved, rotten a country that I was not surprised that they got a communist ideology, and I felt that one has to get out and find the civilized world. Ayn Rand got out of the United States in 1926 at the age of 21, but she did not think of writing Anthem here until she read in the Saturday Evening Post a story laid in the future. It did not have any particular theme, or only the fact that some kind of war had destroyed civilization and that there is a last survivor in the ruins of New York who rebuilds something. No particular plot, it was just an adventure story, but what interested me was the fact that it was the first time I saw a fantastic story in print rather than the folks next door sort of serials. What impressed me was the fact that they would publish such a story, and so I thought that if they did not mind fantasy, I would like to try Anthem. I was working on the plot of the Fountainhead at that time, which was the worst part of any of my struggles. There was nothing I could do except sit and think, which was miserable. I was doing architectural research, but there was no writing I could do yet, and I had to take time off once in a while to write something. So I wrote Anthem that summer of 1937. What followed was a long struggle to get it published, not a struggle in England where it was published at once, but in America where intellectuals intoxicated by communism were at the height or nadir of the Red Decade. I intended Anthem at first as a magazine story or serial, but I think my agent said it would not be for the magazines, and she was probably right. Or if she tried them, she did not succeed. She told me that it should be published as a book, which I had not thought of. She submitted it simultaneously to Macmillan in America, who had published We the Living and whom I had not left yet, and to the English publisher Castle. Castle accepted it immediately. The owner said he was not sure whether it would sell, but it was beautiful and he appreciated it literally, and he wanted to publish it. Macmillan turned it down. Their comment was, the author does not understand socialism. For the next 8 years, nothing was done about Anthem in the United States. Then, in 1945, Leonard Read of Pamphleteers, a small conservative outfit in Los Angeles that published non-fiction essays, decided that Anthem had to have an American audience. Reed brought it out as a pamphlet in 1946. Another conservative house with a meager audience, Caxton, took the book over as a hardcover in 1953. At last, in 1961, about a quarter of a century after it had been written, New American Library issued it as a mass market paperback. I live my life in widening rings which spread over earth and sky. I may not ever complete the last one, but that is what I will try. I circle around God, the primordial tower, and I circle 10,000 years long, and I still don't know if I am a falcon, a storm, or an unfinished song. I am, O anxious one, don't you hear my voice, surging forth with all my earthly feelings? They yearn so high that they have sprouted wings and whitely fly in circles around your face. My soul, dressed in silence, rises up and stands alone before you. Can't you see? Don't you know that my prayer is growing ripe upon your vision as upon a tree? If you are the dreamer, I am what you dream. But when you want to wake, I am your wish, and I grow strong with all magnificence and turn myself into a star's vast silence above the strange and distant city, time. I find you, Lord, in all things and in all my fellow creatures, pulsing with your life as a tiny seed. You sleep in what is small, and in the vast you vastly yield yourself. The wondrous game that power plays with things is to move in such submission through the world, groping in roots and growing thick in trunks and in tree tops like a rising from the dead. Clash, lament. Everything is far and long gone by. I think that the star glittering above me has been dead for a million years. I think there were I had tears in the car I heard pass, and something terrible was said. A clock has stopped striking in the house across the road. When did it start? I would like to step out of my heart and go walking beneath the enormous sky. I would like to pray, and surely of all the stars that perished long ago, one still exists. I think that I know which one it is, which one at the end of its beam in the sky stands like a white city. Autumn day, Lord, it is time. The huge summer has gone by. Now overlap the sundials with your shadows, and on the meadows let the wind go free. Command the fruits to swell on tree and vine. Grant them a few more warm, transparent days. Urge them on to fulfillment then, and press the final sweetness into the heavy wine. Whoever has no house now will never have one. Whoever is alone will stay alone, will sit, read, write long letters through the evening, and wander on the boulevards up and down, restlessly while the dry leaves are blowing. The approach presented here is a classical Buddhist one, not in a formal sense, but in the sense of presenting the heart of the Buddhist approach to spirituality. Although the Buddhist way is not theistic, it does not contradict the theistic disciplines. Rather, the differences between the ways are a matter of emphasis and method. The basic problems of spiritual materialism are common to all spiritual disciplines. The Buddhist approach begins with our confusion and suffering and works toward the unraveling of their origin. The theistic approach begins with the richness of God and works toward raising consciousness so as to experience God's presence. But since the obstacles to relating with God are our confusions and negativities, the theistic approach must also deal with them. Spiritual pride, for example, is as much a problem in theistic disciplines as in Buddhism. According to the Buddhist tradition, the spiritual path is the process of cutting through our confusion, of uncovering the awakened state of mind. When the awakened state of mind is crowded in by ego and its attendant paranoia, it takes on the character of an underlying instinct. So it is not a matter of building up the awakened state of mind, but rather of burning out the confusions which obstruct it. In the process of burning out these confusions, we discover enlightenment. If the process were otherwise, the awakened state of mind would be a product dependent upon cause and effect and therefore liable to dissolution. Anything which is created must sooner or later die. If enlightenment were created in such a way, there would always be the possibility of ego reasserting itself, causing a return to the confused state. Enlightenment is permanent because we have not produced it, we have merely discovered it. In the Buddhist tradition, the analogy of the sun appearing from behind the clouds is often used to explain the discovery of enlightenment. In meditation practice, we clear away the confusion of ego in order to glimpse the awakened state. The absence of ignorance, of being crowded in, of paranoia opens up a tremendous view of life. One discovers a different way of being. The heart of the confusion is that man has a sense of self which seems to him to be continuous and solid. When a thought or emotion or event occurs, there is the sense of someone being conscious of what is happening. You sense that you are reading these words. This sense of self is actually a transitory, discontinuous event which, in our confusion, seems to be quite solid and continuous. Since we take our confused view as being real, we struggle to maintain and enhance this solid self. We try to feed its pleasures and shield it from pain. Experience continually threatens to reveal our transitoriness to us. So we continually struggle to cover up any possibility of discovering our real condition. But we might ask, if our real condition is an awakened state, why are we so busy trying to avoid becoming aware of it? It is because we have come it is because we have become so absorbed in our confused view of the world that we consider it real, the only possible world. This struggle to maintain the sense of a solid, continuous self is the action of ego. Ego, however, is only partially successful in shielding us from pain. It is the dissatisfaction which accompanies ego's struggle that inspires us to examine what we are doing. Since there are always gaps in our self-consciousness, some insight is possible. An interesting metaphor used in Tibetan Buddhism to describe the functioning of ego is that of the three lords of materialism: the lord of form, the lord of speech, and the lord of mind. In the discussion of the three lords which follows, the words materialism and neurotic refer to the action of ego. The lord of form refers to the neurotic's pursuit of physical comfort, security, and pleasure. Our highly organized and technological society reflects our preoccupation with manipulating physical surroundings so as to shield ourselves from the irritations of the raw, rugged, unpredictable aspects of life. Push button elevators, pre-packaged meat, air conditioning, flush toilets, private funerals, retirement programs, mass production, weather satellites, bulldozers, fluorescent lighting, 9 to 5 jobs, television, all are attempts to create a manageable, safe, predictable, pleasurable world. The Lord of Form does not signify the physically rich and secure life situations we create per se. Rather, it refers to the neurotic preoccupation that drives us to create them, to try to control nature. It is ego's ambition to secure and entertain itself, trying to avoid all irritation. So we cling to our pleasures and possessions. We fear change or force change. We try to create a nest or playground. The Lord of Speech refers to the use of intellect in relating to our world. We adopt sets of categories which serve as handles, as ways of managing phenomena. The most fully developed products of this tendency are ideologies, the system of ideas that rationalize, justify, and sanctify our lives. Nationalism, communism, existentialism, Christianity, Buddhism all provide us with identities, rules of action, and interpretations of how and why things happen as they do. Again, the use of intellect is not in itself the Lord of Speech. The Lord of Speech refers to the inclination on the part of the ego to interpret anything that is threatening or irritating in such a way as to neutralize the threat or turn it into something positive from ego's point of view. The Lord of Speech refers to the use of concepts as filters to screen us from a direct perception of what is. The concepts are taken too seriously. They are used as tools to solidify our world and ourselves. If a world of nameable things exists, then I, as one of the nameable things, exists as well. We wish not to leave any room for threatening doubt, uncertainty, or confusion. The Lord of Mind refers to the effort of consciousness to maintain awareness of itself. The Lord of Mind rules when we use spiritual and psychological disciplines as the means of maintaining our self consciousness, of holding on to our sense of self. Drugs, yoga, prayer, meditation, trances, various psychotherapies all can be used in this way. Ego is able to convert everything to its own use, even spirituality. For example, if you have learned of a particularly beneficial meditation technique of spiritual practice, then ego's attitude is first to regard it as an object of fascination and second to examine it. Finally, since ego is seeming solid and cannot really absorb anything, it can only mimic. Thus, ego tries to examine and imitate the practice of meditation and the meditative way of life. When we have learned all the tricks and answers of the spiritual game, we automatically try to imitate spirituality. Since real involvement would require the complete elimination of ego, and actually, the last thing we want to do is to give up the ego completely. However, we cannot experience that which we are trying to imitate. We can only find some area within the bounds of ego that seems to be the same thing. Ego translates everything in terms of its own state of health, its own inherent qualities. It feels a sense of great accomplishment and excitement at having been able to create such a pattern. At last, it has created a tangible accomplishment, a confirmation of its own individuality. If we become successful at maintaining our self consciousness through spiritual techniques, then genuine spiritual development is highly unlikely. Our mental habits become so strong as to be hard to penetrate. We may even go so far as to achieve the totally demonic state of complete egohood. Even though the Lord of Mind is the most powerful in subverting spirituality, still the other two Lords can also rule the spiritual practice. Retreat to nature, isolation, simple, quiet, high people, all can be ways of shielding oneself from irritation. All can be expressions of the Lord of Form. Or perhaps religion may provide us with a rationalization for creating a secure nest, a simple but comfortable home for acquiring an amiable mate and a stable, easy job. The Lord of Speech is involved in spiritual practice as well. In following a spiritual path, we may substitute a new religious ideology for our formal beliefs, but continue to use it in the old neurotic way, regardless of how sublime our ideas may be. If we take them too seriously and use them to maintain our ego, we are still being ruled by the Lord of Speech. Most of us, if we examine our actions, would probably agree that we are ruled by one or more of the three lords, but we might ask, so what? This is simply a description of the human condition. Yes, we know that our technology cannot shield us from war, crime, illness, economic insecurity, laborious work, old age, and death. Nor can our ideologies shield us from doubt, uncertainty, confusion, and disorientation. Nor can our therapies protect us from the dissolution of the high states of consciousness that we may temporarily achieve and the disillusionment and anguish that follow. But what else are we to do? The three lords seem too powerful to overthrow, and we don't know what to replace them with. The Buddha, troubled by these questions, examined the process by which the three lords rule. He questioned why our minds follow them and whether there is another way. He discovered that the three lords seduce us by creating a fundamental myth that we are solid beings, but ultimately the myth is false, a huge hoax, a gigantic fraud, and it is the root of our suffering. In order to make this discovery, he had to break through very elaborate defenses erected by the three lords to prevent their subjects from discovering the fundamental deception which is the source of their power. We cannot in any way free ourselves from the domination of the three lords unless we too cut through layer by layer the elaborate defenses of these lords. The Lord's defenses are created out of the material of our minds. This material of mind is used by the Lords in such a way as to maintain the basic myth of solidity. In order to see for ourselves how this process works, we must examine our own experience. But how, we might ask, are we to conduct the examination? What method or tool are we to use? The method that the Buddha discovered is meditation. He discovered that struggling to find answers did not work. It was only when there were gaps in his struggle that insights came to him. He began to realize that there was a same he began to realize that there was a sane, awake quality within him which manifested itself only in the absence of struggle. So the practice of meditation involves letting be. provided startling examples of the ways in which a miscellaneous series of events could be converted into an historical pattern and could even be regarded as the final completion of a pattern that had been forming slowly over the centuries. In historical writing, as in literature, there are canonical interpretations. Joyce includes these in order to inspect their authority and give voice to their tacit assumptions. The assurance of historical interpretation is destroyed by the disintegration of the language that was both created by and creator of the assurance. Many of the disputes in the week involved assaults on and defenses of language. The most important division is that between male patriarchal language that is always seeking to impose order on diverse materials and female language that reveals in heterogeneity and ridicules authority. By transmuting the philosophical problem of historical or any writing into a gender division, Joyce finds a point of vantage that includes colonial oppression, the canonization of authority, and the authorizing of canonicity, the relationship between fully formed language and the inchoate sounds from which it is derived and over which it is constantly reasserting itself. Ultimately, he also finds here the comprehensive figure for self-division, for a broken world in which the masculine and the feminine are separated. The first made dominant over the second, consequent and subsequent neurosis with the consequent and subsequent neuroses, rebellions, maimings, and nightmares. Still, the Wake does not offer a reconciliation between masculine and feminine languages or divisions. Were there to be such, then the implication would seem to be there would no longer be history or narrative, for then we would not have to suffer any longer the consequences of the fall into language. We would be redeemed back to that original directness of knowledge that preceded language, the mark of our inescapable secondariness. The secondariness of language is reproduced in every other form of secondariness that the world knows, most particularly the secondariness of female against male, and therefore and thereafter all the varieties of oppression, of which this is the most basic and enduring. Given the immense scholarship generated by the Wake since its publication in 1939, the contemporary reader has a considerable advantage over those who first saw it in print. One of the features of modernist literature is its insistent calling upon the monuments of the very culture which it believes the modern readership to have abandoned. It may be that the originality of a work is directly proportional to the ignorance of its readers. Today's reader is at least equipped to overcome the ignorance by adverting to the various guides, concordances, lexicons, and annotations that have been provided for the week. Still, it is surely a strange experience to find that a book such as this one is so deeply indebted to earlier writings. In the earlier portrait of the artist as a young man, the famous Hellfire sermon in chapter 3 is so derivative of a standard Jesuit text that it might almost be called a plagiarism, but we tend to dismiss that as an inappropriate charge and replace it with more anodyne or glamorous descriptions such as quotation or intertextuality. It is indeed the case that portrait deploys an intricate system of quotation throughout, and that this instance of the sermon is a tactic in an overall strategy. But the earlier novel reminds us that this issue seemed to exert a certain fascination on Joyce. Ulysses and Wake are saturated in quotations from and references to writings by other people. If we do not recognize these or their sources, and for the most part we do not, without the help of guidance from Joycean scholars, are we in some sense disqualified as competent readers? It seems the answer must be yes, even though our incompetence is itself already incorporated into modernism's diagnosis of modernity. We ratify these texts by being helpless before them, and then are taught the full range of our incompetence by having the full extent of the plagiarism or system of quotation the texts encompass revealed to us. But since that revelation is one of the characteristic procedures of such works, We are obliged to recognize the high strategy involved in the plundering of the past, the last word in stolen telling. Finnegan's Wake 424.35 and rechristen it as one of the forms that intertextuality takes in modernist writing. The problem with this apotheosis of intertextuality is that it canonizes obscurity as one of the signs of art and institutionalizes those works, not just literature, that very often found in just such obscurity a strategy of subversion. Along with the institutionalizing of the work of art, there is a corresponding institutionalizing of the modern reader as a cultureless recipient. This in part explains the consequent withdrawal of art into a ghetto for specialists whose task it is to translate the work in such a way that the cultural impoverishment of the mass audience can both be confirmed. Otherwise, there would be no need for such an army of specialists and relieved. Finally, works of art, just in virtue of being so regarded in this context, are politically neutralized. They rejoin the canon they took so much trouble to subvert. This is part of the history of Finnegan's Wake, as it is part of the general history of modernism in all the arts. The book is a titanic exercise in remembering everything at the level of the unconscious, because at the conscious level so much has been repressed that amnesia is the abiding condition. Joyce's Ireland was a perfect example of this dual state of remembering and forgetting everything. For 50 years before the publication of the Wake, the country had been engaged in rewriting its past in the hope of realizing for itself a future other than that of a peculiar kind of colony within the United Kingdom. The Irish revival, with the Abbey Theatre as its centerpiece, the Gaelic language, the Gaelic League, with its program for the revival of the Irish language and the de-Anglicisation of Ireland, Sinn Féin, a political organization that took two forms, one constitutional and nationalist, the other revolutionary and republican, the IRB, the IRA. The political parties of the 1920s and 1930s in the new Free State were the most prominent of a number of movements that aimed at the reconstruction of the past and the present. In the period after the Civil War of 1922 to 1923, revolutionary Ireland became a fortress island, aided by the Catholic Church in the establishment of a notion of Ireland as different, especially within the English-speaking world. Because it had remained traditional, anti-modern, loyal to the old faith and to the pieties that the old faith claimed were integral to the Irish heritage and its own teaching. In a sense, much of what Joyce had feared and written of came to pass. Ireland, or part of it, freed itself from the British yoke only to submit ever more slavishly to the Roman. But both the revolutionary and the conservative impulses shared the determination to define Ireland as a special place, radically different from all others, especially Britain, and definitively not of the modern world. In each case, the Irish spirit was essentialized, and the history of its emergence was widely propagandized. It was Celtic, Gaelic, Anglo-Irish, Catholic. The combination did not matter quite so much as did the readiness to seek and find within the past the destiny of any one or any combination of these pre-inscribed elements. It would be wrong to say that Joyce was the only Irish writer of this period to espouse a more heterogeneous version of the past, but it was he, more than any, who found a means of enacting it in fiction with a thoroughness that brought the issue of tradition, heritage, destiny, and all the rest of those big words that make us so unhappy to the point of collapse, the nihilization of the atom. Finnegan's Wake 353.22. This is truly the Dublin where Motley is born instead of Yeatsian apocalypse, secret doctrine, and aristocracy. Here we have the sovereign rule of gospirocracy. Finnegan's Wake 476.3. Writing to his friend Arthur Power, Joyce declared, "For myself, I always write about Dublin because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities in the world. In the particular is contained the universal." Perhaps with his usual blend of the astonishing and the trite, Joyce is here announcing a program for both Ulysses and the Wake. To know something in all its particularity, to see it so that the object achieves its epiphany, Stephen Hero, chapter 25, was the aesthetic ambition of Dubliners, Stephen Hero, and Portrait. But in the later works, that ambition is not abandoned. Instead, it is recognized as belonging to one form of discourse, that of the heroic individual or author, expanded to produce another kind of writing. The single white light of the epiphanic seizure, refracted through the prism of language, is emitted as the spectrum of all the colors.